All right. I'll call the meeting back to order for House Judiciary. Today we're going to hear a presentation by the Michigan Department of Corrections. We have Kyle Kaminsky here. Kyle, you can come on up to the table, and we'll let you get through your presentation real quick, and then we'll ask you a bunch of questions probably. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. That sounds just fine with me. As introduced, but just for the record, Kyle Kaminsky, I'm the OS Administrator and the Legislative Liaison for the Michigan Department of Corrections. I'm excited to be here today. I do have a quick presentation and to talk a little bit about the structure of the MDOC, some key stats, but then I'm happy to try my best to answer questions from there on anything that is of interest to the committee. So starting out, kind of the question of what is the goal of the MDOC? And want to be clear, as an agency, our primary focus is public safety. But public safety happens at different points in time, and we want to make sure we're achieving not only near-term public safety, and we do that through the operation of our prisons, effective supervision in the community on parole and probation, but we also want to generate long-term public safety. And the best way to do that is to actually get people who are in the criminal justice system to change their behaviors, their thinking, their decisions, their opportunities, so that they're less likely to create future crimes. We do both of these things. So for us, it's not a question of which one of these do we choose. For us, it's a matter of we need to do both of these to really be effective in the criminal justice system. So we want to make sure that we have world-class facilities that keep people safe, but we also want to make sure that those facilities have opportunities in them, whether it's educational opportunities, evidence-based programming opportunities, opportunities to improve skills so that when people go home, and again, most people in the state prison system will go home, they go home in a better place than when they entered the MDOC. So talking a little bit about our operations, we have 26 prisons around the state. We also operate currently the Detroit Detention Center under contract with the city of Detroit. That's a lockup, so a little different than a prison. We have over 100 field offices that supervise parolees, who are people who have been in state prison, who are under a term of supervision, as well as felony probationers. So we supervise felony probationers for the circuit courts. We are generally not involved in the supervision of misdemeanor probationers, which are handled by the district courts and local district court staff. We are an agency of around 11,000 employees. But only about half of those are engaged in direct custody functions. So obviously the biggest group of employees we have are our corrections officers who work in all of our facilities. But we also are a department of educators, of healthcare providers, of mental health providers, field agents, staff focused on reentry, accountants, food service, et cetera. We often talk about the idea that we're essentially operating 26 small cities. And so we have to do everything that would make a city function with all of the custody and security procedures that go along with ensuring that people who are in those facilities remain in those facilities. A key thing is that we touch every county of the state. So we have just over 32,000 individuals in our prisons currently, but we have about 32,000 additional folks on felony probation and about 9,000 on parole. So over 70,000 Michigan residents on a daily basis are under the jurisdiction of the MDOC. These numbers, and I'll talk a little more about numbers later, these numbers are actually much lower than they used to be. I used to have a talking point, which I can no longer use, that on any given day, 1% of Michigan's population was under the jurisdiction of the MDOC, because we used to have 90,000 plus when you combined our three phases. And then finally, from a budgetary perspective, we are a primarily general fund supported operation of state government with a budget that is slightly over $2 billion per year. Our main cost is obviously staffing and the operation of the prisons. Staffing costs are north of 72% of how those dollars are spent. So quickly going through kind of the main structures of the Michigan Department of Corrections, our largest internal administration is called the Correctional Facilities Administration. They're responsible for operating those 26 prisons. So they handle all of our custody functions, but they also handle healthcare, key services within the facilities such as food service, transportation of individuals between facilities, emergency management, records, classification, et cetera. They also are responsible for maintaining the facilities. We have 6 facilities in the Upper Peninsula, 20 facilities in the Lower Peninsula. We have an assistant deputy director over each region. So there's a northern region, which is not just the UP, but northern Michigan and the UP, and then we have a southern region. Our northern region is out of the Kinchlow area in the eastern Upper Peninsula, and our southern region is out of Jackson. Obviously, our state headquarters is here out of Lansing. Our next largest administration is field operations. So again, these are the folks that supervise individuals in communities all around the state. We provide supervision in all 83 counties. As I mentioned, we have 100 plus field offices where that service is performed from. Most counties will have at least one office. Some very rural counties might share an office with a neighboring county, and some very large counties might have two, just for the sake of being able to serve populations in a geographically sane way. This group also operates our electronic monitoring center, or our electronic monitoring operations. So many individuals on parole and some individuals on probation are subject to GPS monitoring of their locations. So this group handles that. This group also has our absconder recovery unit. So when individuals are on parole and are failing to report as required, our absconder recovery unit, which works around the state, will work either independently or with task forces made up of other law enforcement agencies to reapprehend those individuals for the sake of parole violation processing. Field operations also interfaces with the courts and local law enforcement on a daily basis. So, for instance, our probation agents write what are called the pre-sentence investigations. Those are the reports that the judge uses after a person's been found guilty, but before they're sentenced. That's sort of the document that puts together all the information relevant to that case for the sake of sentencing. We also have embedded agents. So in many of our larger communities, we actually have agents that are MDOC employees, but they're embedded with local law enforcement to make the sharing of information between the MDOC and local law enforcement more efficient. So that's something that we've developed over time. Again, just to make sure that we are a partner in the community. We are not technically a law enforcement agency. Our staff are not MCOLS certified. In various places in statute, when it refers to law enforcement, that does not cover the MDOC. So we rely on and partner with law enforcement all around the state. Our third major administration is the Budget and Operations Administration. This is the group that does a lot of the supportive services for the entire department. So HR, legal, physical plant, meaning larger projects and design of our facilities. HR also includes our employee wellness unit. This group also does our recruitment and training, and I'll talk a little more about staffing and recruitment on a future slide, and also oversees the Michigan State Industries program. So several of our facilities have Michigan State Industries factories. These are independent. They have their own budget line. They have to operate based on selling the product for more than it costs to make it, but they're allowed to utilize labor within the facilities, and they can sell to government agencies as well as nonprofits. The MDOC is the largest customer of MSI products, but many local jails, others will use them as well. Some examples, we have cut and sew operations that make officer uniforms, make prisoner uniforms. We have a mattress operation. We have a print shop. We actually have some specialized things. So we have our own optical labs that we can make all of our own eyeglasses for our population. We have our own dental labs, so we can make dentures and partials for our population. And so this is a key part of our operations. Probably the most famous MSI operation is our license plate factory, which is located in Adrian. Every license plate on a vehicle in the state of Michigan was stamped at that factory in Adrian and then sold to the Department of State for drivers to use. Finally, the last group is the Executive Bureau and Offender Success Administration. So the Executive Bureau is essentially the director's office and everything that kind of falls underneath it. That includes things like our Public Information Office, Internal Affairs, Employee Discipline, Process Improvement, Legislative Affairs, of which I'm part of. And then Offender Success, which I'm actually the administrator of, is essentially education, reentry, and programming for the Department of Corrections. So we work in all three spaces: probation, prison, and parole. We do a lot of the programmatic stuff, so evidence-based programming, education. We're actually the largest adult basic education provider in the state of Michigan because about half the people who come to prison each year do not have a high school diploma. So we will help them with that, but then we also have current technical education opportunities, post-secondary opportunities, and then we support other things like vital documents, reentry planning, and supports. In the community, we actually contract with administrative agencies on a regional basis to provide the services. So we're not, we're not a landlord in the community. We don't provide a lot of direct services in the community. Instead, we work with those regional agencies that competitively bid to secure services for their region. And we use the 10 state prosperity regions for that. So I want to talk briefly about staffing because I think this is maybe the subject that we've talked to the legislature the most about over the last couple of years. While we've made progress in a lot of areas, we still face some staffing challenges, and I suspect those of you, particularly those of you that have prisons in your district, are potentially continuing to hear about this. On a statewide basis, we have about 875 corrections officer vacancies, and that's against, if we were fully staffed, probably somewhere between 52 to 5,500 positions. We are operating quarterly academies and have for many years. We split the academies, so each academy has both a UP class and a Lower Peninsula class. The Lower Peninsula class obviously is the larger of the two because it serves more facilities. Our two most recent academies were actually very strong. We had 275 plus people start each of those academies. The preceding 4 academies were each around 180. So we actually saw about 100 participant bump for each of the last 2. We are currently finalizing recruiting for our next academy class, and then we'll have one more this fiscal year, and then we'll start again with our 4. We have seen stabilization at several of our facilities from a corrections officer staffing perspective. So at less than 7%, and quite honestly, we have several facilities that are pretty much at 0% vacancies or maybe 1 or 2% vacancies. It is increasingly looking like a regional challenge. So the 2 main challenge areas remain the Upper Peninsula and Jackson, where we have 4 facilities that we need to staff and support. But we've seen those other facilities, several other facilities stabilize. We kind of have that middle group of facilities that are operating with somewhere between 8 and 25% vacancies. That obviously results in more overtime for staff, including mandated overtime, because we have to hit minimum staffing for each shift. And then again, we have those 6 facilities that are above 25%. Staffing and recruiting remains a primary focus for the department. So hopefully you've seen ads, whether they're on TV, billboards, social media. We are making a push, particularly in the communities where we operate, and doing a lot of work on that. The other thing, though, is recruitment is half of the equation. The other half of the equation is retention. And so I think that we are continuing to see some challenges there, particularly early career retention. Folks moving into this field, but not necessarily staying beyond 5 years. Some of that we think is maybe reflective of the current workforce and of the current labor market that has seen a lot of people kind of try things out, transition around. What we offer more than anything is stability. These facilities operate day in and day out. If you're a employee in good standing, you can have a career with us. You have a lot of opportunities for advancement. What we don't offer is some of the flexibility that other employers offer. This is in-person work. It is shift work. It is seniority-based oftentimes. Well, it is seniority-based in terms of when you're going to work. So when you start out, you may be a 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. with your weekend being Tuesday and Wednesday. And for some folks entering the workforce, that's not what they're looking for. And so that's something that we kind of have to gauge. Now, we've worked with the Office of the State Employer as well as MCO, which is the union that represents our officers, and made several changes around compensation the last few years. That includes not only negotiated increases similar to what all state employees get, but we also compress the timing of the wage scale. So each step now, or folks can essentially reach the old top step of the pay scale more quickly. So we're trying to advance people through kind of those early raises faster to keep them engaged and employed with us. And then on October 1st, there will be a new top step added at 54 months of service. So to be a top wage corrections officer, it's 54 months, or it will be 54 months as of October 1st to reach that. As of October 1st, our starting pay will be $23.45 an hour. So that's what you would be paid to go to the academy, and you are paid while you're in the academy with us. And that's what you'd be paid when you started. And then at top step, so if you have 54 months of service, you'd be at $35.22 an hour, or over $73,000 a year before overtime. So we are, as a state, trying to be competitive in this area. We think these numbers are helping to move things in the right direction, obviously, with our recent academy classes, but we also recognize there's more work to be done, particularly at some of these sites where the demographics are challenging. Workforces are shrinking, or there's competitors in those spaces or those geographic areas that we're having to compete against for employees. So I want to talk through some key statistics real quick. So this is the prison population. This is probably the statistic we get asked about the most. And this is sort of looking at, and I apologize, For some reason, the PowerPoint kind of knocked the x-axis off of this, but this is going back. On the left-hand side is roughly 1991, 1990, and on the right-hand side is December of 2024. So you can see sort of the trajectory of Michigan's prison population. Through the 80s and 90s, we saw rapid increases, kind of unabated rapid increases in the state prison population. In the early 2000s, mid-2000s, we saw the state hit its peak, which was about 51,000 individuals incarcerated in state prisons. Since then, we've had kind of overall pretty steady decline, although you could potentially divide it into kind of 3 periods of decline, where we've seen that the prison population has declined, and we're back down just over 32,500-ish right now, and that's roughly where we're at in 1991. We are in a period of relative stability with the prisoner population. So we've been kind of flat between 33,000 now for a couple of years. We do a 5-year forward projection on the prison population. That's also showing stability to a slight decline, but nothing significant in terms of shifts either up or down. That analysis is obviously done based on kind of current trends as well as the current statutory environment, regulatory environment. Any significant changes to sentencing or things like that could obviously impact that. So looking at some of the key trends, and I kind of labeled these input trends because I think these are the things that sort of on the front end help to drive the prison population either up or down. And keep in mind, obviously, the Department of Corrections, we are a key element of the criminal justice system, but we are certainly not alone in the criminal justice system. It's prosecutors, it's the court, it's law enforcement. All of us kind of fit together, and ultimately the Department of Corrections is sort of towards the end of that process. You know, we don't decide if somebody is going to be charged with something. We don't decide what their sentence is going to be. That's going to be the prosecutor and then the judge. But we will eventually, if they're sentenced to us, receive them under our jurisdiction, and we'll kind of go from there. So felony dispositions is the total number of people convicted of a felony in each year. And as you can see, felony dispositions statewide have decreased significantly over the last 20 years. So the left-hand column's 2004, the middle one's 2014, and the right-hand one is 2024. We initially thought that some of the decrease that we were seeing over the last 4 or 5 years was probably COVID-driven. Certainly, we saw a significant drop-off in court activity in 2020 and 2021 due to COVID. But it seems at this point now that we're kind of 5 years out, that some of that decline appears to be lasting. It's not just due to COVID. Now, keep in mind, just because you get a felony does not mean you're coming to prison. In fact, only about 20% of these dispositions are actually going to result in a prison sentence. It's going to be far more common to either receive probation or jail followed by probation, or in a small number of cases, maybe just like fines and costs. So prison, though, is only about 20% of those cases. The next chart on the right is probation violators sentenced to prison. So if you assume that most cases initially, particularly those that don't have much of a criminal history, are going to start with probation as a likely sentence, you're going to be supervised in the community, but future violations, either of criminal law or just the terms of your probation, could result in you being sent to prison. This historically was an area where a lot of the prison population came from. Essentially, people put on probation who were not successful and then eventually came to prison. Again, though, as you can see, we've seen a significant decline in probation violators sentenced to prison. I think you can point to a few things for what's driving that. Some of it is some statutory changes. There were some reforms made roughly 5 years ago that placed a little more limitation on how judges could respond to some of these violations. But the other thing is, as a state, I think we've gotten smarter about trying to invest more on the front end in probation, specialty courts, effective programming in the communities, et cetera. And with that, we see more people successful. They essentially discharge from probation successfully without the need to come to prison. The last kind of input trend I wanted to show you, because this one is not quite as good from the MDOC's perspective, is the average minimum sentence of those who are coming to prison. So it used to be it was just under 42 months in 2004. Now it's over 61 months. So we exclude life sentences because there's no real way to calculate those into this number. But everybody else coming to prison, we take everybody in that year, what their minimum sentence is from the judge, and then figure out what the average is. Now, there's probably some just kind of basic math involved here. There's fewer dispositions. That might mean that the people who are coming to prison are the same people who are always coming to prison, and they always had more severe sentences, and it's less severe sentences that are kind of disappearing out of the system. But this is something that I think as policymakers, you should, keep in mind and pay attention to, because ultimately this means that the people who are coming to prison have longer to serve before they can potentially go home. And there's a cost to that. There's an impact to that folks should keep in mind. Oh, sorry. So flipping to some of the output trends. So these are kind of the things that I would say are on the back end of the MDOC's process that can impact population and are relevant to these discussions. So the first is parole approval rate, and I have a couple slides. I'll talk a little more about the parole process coming up. But the overall parole approval rate, while it's relatively stable over the last 10 years, certainly much higher than it was 20 years ago. And so we went from about a 50% parole approval rate to about a 68% parole approval rate. Several reasons for that, and I'll talk more about them when I get to that section, but I think one of the key things is a more objective, evidence-based process for parole has resulted in more positive parole decisions. Once those decisions are made, obviously, two things we want to, before we get to that, I'll go down to the moves to parole. So although the parole approval rate is up, the actual number of people paroling each year is down. And the reason for that is the population is down. So you have less of a base from which to parole people. So even though we're at 68% now, we only had just over 6,000 people paroled last year, compared to 2004, when even though the parole approval rate was closer to 50%, you actually had 11,000 people leaving prison each year. So the number of cases has become more condensed, and with that, it's allowed us to focus more on what those individual cases need. So looking at the right-hand column, there's sort of two factors that can bring somebody back to prison when they're on parole. One is a new sentence. So you receive a new felony, you go through the entire court process, you're charged, you're convicted, you're sentenced, and you come back to prison. That number has declined significantly. In fact, it's only about a third of what it was 20 years ago. So indicative of the fact that people on parole now are much less likely to commit a new crime and be convicted and sent back to prison. The other group are the technical violators. So this may or may not be a criminal offense. In many cases it's not, but it's possible that it is actually a criminal offense, but it's not being charged or it's taking time to go through the court process, so the MDOC will pull the person back into prison on a violation as a technical violation. But again, that's declined and is only about a third of what it was 20 years ago as well. A lot of that comes down to improved supervision techniques. There's been a lot of research and study done over the last couple decades nationally, not just in Michigan, around kind of how do you effectively supervise people in the community to reduce their risk. Michigan as a state has been very aggressive in trying to adopt those policies and those practices to make sure that we're taking advantage of what has been learned. So looking at the prison population, and there's two pie charts here. The one on the left is everybody who came to prison last year by their offense category. And so you can see that for those that came to prison last year by their offense category, about half, just under a half, came for either a non-assaultive offense or a drug offense. And the other half came for either an assaultive offense or an offense involving death, which would be an assaultive offense too, obviously, but more severe. But when you look at the full prison population, which is the right-hand chart, you see that over 75% of people in prison are serving for an assaultive offense. And that's, I think, easy to understand from the perspective of, yes, many people come in for a variety of offenses, but the people who are most likely to kind of still be in prison over an extended duration of time are those that are most likely to have committed a more serious offense. And so you see, again, sort of this accumulation of assaultive offenses within the prison population. But I think this is important to point out because we do sometimes hear in media and elsewhere sort of misstatements about who's in prison, that everybody in prison's there for kind of non-assaultive stuff or, very low-level stuff. Again, only 20% of the people sentenced for a felony each year are coming to prison. So the folks that are with us generally are with us for an assaultive offense. Again, just to note that the average cumulative minimum term for that 2024 group was about 5.1 years. But when you look at the people who are everybody in prison, their actual average minimum is about 12 years. So final kind of data slide is around parole eligibility of the prison population. So like I said, we have just over 32,000 people who are incarcerated in the state of Michigan. We will oftentimes get the question of like, well, how many of those are parole eligible? And the answer is only a small percentage of them. So the large red wedge here, which is almost 3/4, are people who are serving a term of year sentence who are not yet eligible for parole. They have not served their minimum sentence. And in Michigan, we are a truth in sentencing state. and have been for over 2 decades, meaning anybody sentenced since roughly 1998, when the judge says your minimum is a year or they say your minimum is 5 years, you have to serve every day of that year or that 5 years before you can be considered for parole. You, as the legislature, set the statutory maximum, so anybody convicted of that crime can be held under our jurisdiction up until whatever the statutory maximum is. But when it comes to parole consideration parole cannot be granted until that person has served 100% of that minimum sentence. So there's no such thing as early parole in Michigan. Everybody paroled in Michigan has served their minimum sentence. There is a slight caveat. There's a special medical parole in statute for certain people who have very serious medical conditions. But other than that, everybody has served their minimum. The yellow wedge is folks serving non-parolable life sentences. So in Michigan, for murder in the first degree, felony murder, meaning you're in the commission of another felony and a life is taken, and some related kind of subsets of murder in the first degree, the sentence is life without parole, and that truly means life without parole. There is no parole consideration in those cases. The only way to exit prison on those cases would be a commutation from whoever the sitting governor is at the time or when somebody passes away. The green sliver, which is only 2%, are parolable life sentences. So there are sentences in Michigan for a whole host of offenses, armed robbery, murder in the second degree, certain CSC cases, where the court can issue a life sentence, but it's a parolable life sentence, which means in most cases you can be considered for parole after serving 15 years of your sentence. You are not, there is no maximum, so you could be held until you pass away, but at 15 years you can start to be considered for parole. The orange wedge, which is 4%, are folks who have previously paroled but have returned to prison for violating their parole. So that is the group that are technically parole eligible today because they've already served their minimum sentence, but having been given the liberty of parole, have not performed adequately to remain in that status and been returned to prison. They will be considered for parole again. Under statute, we generally have to consider cases either each year or every other year, but right now that is their status. And then finally, the kind of blue-green wedge, which is 9%, those are folks who are eligible for parole but have not been paroled. So the parole board has reviewed those cases because the parole board reviews every eligible case, but the parole board has determined that in those cases they are not comfortable that the person meets the statutory requirements for parole. Now, in some of those cases, it may be that the parole board is saying, we would like for you to complete a certain program, and once you complete that, we will reconsider you and potentially parole you at that time. In other cases, the parole board may simply be saying, we do not have confidence that you meet the statutory requirements for parole, so we are going to deny you parole and we will reconsider you again in the future. So with that, I did want to talk a little bit about the parole board. It is a 10-member board appointed by the director of the Department of Corrections. The board is made up of a mix of MDOC employees from a variety of backgrounds. Oftentimes they have experience in field supervision or field management, but we also have folks on the board with programming experience, folks on the board with correctional facility experience, and then we have members of the public that are appointed to kind of fill out the remaining spots, usually, again, sort of a diverse group of folks that we're seeking to have serve in that role. The parole board's authority is statutory, so within the Corrections Code, it lays out how the parole board will act and where its authority comes from. Again, the parole board's main authority is to grant parole to somebody who has served their full minimum sentence, and the Corrections Code lays out the standard for that they must not be a menace to the community or society if they are released. Each case is scored using what are called parole guidelines, so that's one of the initial steps. The parole guidelines push everybody into one of three categories: low probability of parole, average probability of parole, or high probability of parole. The guidelines do not decide if you're getting parole or not. They simply help stratify cases so that the parole board can look at those cases and kind of know before they get to the interviews and the more in-depth file review where those cases kind of fall within those three categories. There is within statute where some elements where those scorings matter. For instance, if you're low probability of parole, the parole board doesn't actually have to interview you. They can just deny you parole until your average probability of parole. So the board may still interview you because they may see value in engaging with you and trying to talk through why you're in that category, but they're not required to do that before denying. Also, if you're in the high probability of parole category, you fall under something called objective parole, which is something that the legislature adopted several years ago, which limits the reasons the parole board can deny you parole. So it sort of further limits, like if somebody has done everything that's expected of them, they place themselves in that high probability category, there is generally an expectation of parole, if not for the factors that are laid out in statute. The key thing, and I know this can be sometimes challenging for the public and others to fully understand, is the parole board's job is not to determine the punishment for the crime. That falls to the sentencing court. So the court will have already decided what the appropriate minimum sentence is, and again, the legislature will have established a statutory maximum. The parole board's decision is not based on should this person be punished further. The parole board's decision is, this person as they stand before us now, are they ready for parole? Do they meet the statutory standard to return to the community, and can they do so safely? That can be challenging. I think a lot of people probably think that, the parole board should primarily weigh in on what's the elements of the crime or what's the severity of the crime, but really the parole board's job and their requirement is to be objective and say, what is this person's risk today? Has that risk been mitigated or not mitigated? To do that, they use a structured decision-making model, so they're looking for key elements in all cases. They're gleaning that through not only file reviews, but an interview of the individual who is up for parole. Also, and I think I'll cover this in the next slide too, but if there's a victim, a registered victim, the parole board will engage with the registered victim so that they can also get their thoughts about the case on the record. The parole board ultimately is looking at both aggravating and mitigating factors when they make these decisions. So as I said, if you are a registered crime victim, you will receive notice that a case is coming up for parole consideration. You'll also receive notice about how you can engage with the parole board. That can be an actual interview. It can be submitting materials. It's up to the victim. It's not a direct confrontation with the person who is up for parole, though, with the exception of if somebody's serving a parolable life sentence, there's an actual public hearing where like everybody can participate at the same time. But when it comes to a standard parole interview process, the parole board member is going to interview the prisoner and the victim separately, so that they don't have to confront each other. And in fact, the prisoner does not even know if the victim has testified or engaged with the board or not. That's confidential information that just the board weighs out to protect that victim. That information is not shared with the person being considered for parole. Once a decision to grant parole is made by the parole board, there is an opportunity for the registered victim, the prosecutor, the attorney general to appeal the grant of parole. Those appeals are rare, and successful appeals are even rarer. The appeal is not based on one of those parties thinking that the parole board should have simply made the different decision. They actually have to show that the parole board abused its statutory discretion in making the decision. So it's a little higher standard that must be met. Obviously, the department and the parole board, if there's an appeal, we participate in that process. We would pause the parole. The person would not physically leave prison until that is resolved. Also, statute requires us to provide notice to any registered victim and the prosecutor of a positive parole grant. So even if I were granted parole today, let's say I'm eligible, I cannot leave prison today. At least 28 days have to pass before I can leave prison. In practice, we oftentimes use 30 days, just to make sure that notice is made to the victims, the prosecutors, in case they wanted to file an appeal, to make sure they have that window of time to do that before I'm physically out in the community. Again, the parole board's going to make about 10,000 decisions each year right now with the numbers that we have. They're going to be interviewing quite a few cases, as you might imagine, with 10 members. The actual interviews are done remote with video. They're not remote in the sense that the parole board's just down the street from us right now doing interviews, but they don't physically go to the prisons anymore to do it. It's just not very efficient. So the prisoner appears on video and engages with the parole board members who are here in Lansing to do that. They're also going to have at least once a month what's called executive session. So for a normal case, it just requires 2 of 3 parole board members who are on a panel to vote to support parole or deny parole. You don't need 6 of 10. But for any case involving a life sentence, you need 6 of 10. So the parole board has what's called executive session at least once a month, where they discuss those more complicated cases collectively as all 10 to make those decisions. So if somebody is granted parole, the parole board's going to establish some initial supervision guidelines. One of that will be the term of supervision. So how long will the person actually be supervised? Oftentimes you're going to see like 12 months, 18 months, 24 months. It'll be a somewhat round number like that. For those serving a life sentence, statutorily, it must be 48 months. They're also going to establish standard and special supervision requirements for the case. The standard ones are kind of what you'd expect. You need to find employment. You need to have stable housing. You need to, not use drugs or alcohol. You need to report as required by your agent, et cetera. Special terms might be, for instance, there might be a victim in the case where the parole board will enter a no contact. So you cannot be within X number of feet of this person or their family or their residence. There may also be special conditions like you need to do some kind of specialized programming in the community, and a failure to do that could result in your return to prison. The supervision itself is carried out by our parole and probation agents around the state who are MDOC employees. In larger counties, agents are usually either parole or probation. In smaller counties, they might carry both titles. They're going to be actively managing their caseload. Their caseload is going to report depending on their risk level and kind of where they're at in terms of how they're doing. Are they employed? If they're employed and doing well, they have to report less often. If they're not employed, they're struggling a little bit, they're going to have to report to the office more often. So we use those tools to try to get folks ultimately to the goal of self-sufficiency. We want people to be employed, we want them to be law-abiding, and we want them engaged in their community. And so the agents are focused on that to try to get them to that point. Ultimately, there are cases where folks pose a threat to the public after they have been released from prison on parole. If that's the case, we have violation processes. Starts usually with the agent or the agent supervisor, goes through a couple different steps, and we can do either kind of interim sanctions, so there may be penalties that we apply. An example might be, hey, you're going to be arrested, you're going to spend 3 or 4 days in the county jail, and then you're going to come back out and we're going to see where you're at. It might be we're going to put you in a residential program somewhere that's not a secure residential program, but it's a required residential program. Or if it's serious, we may make the decision that we're going to return you to the MDOC and we'll start violation proceedings. Because parole violations and returning to prison does impact the person's liberty interest, you do have to go through a hearings process. That's not a court process for a technical violation, it's an MDOC process, but we do have to go through an actual hearings process with them. We can't just kind of willy-nilly pull people back inside. We have to prove that they've done what we think they've done. So we go through that process, and then the parole board can revoke their parole. That would return them to prison. And again, at that point, they'd be reviewed again after some period of time for parole consideration again in the future. So outcomes, and I'm coming close to the end, I promise. Outcomes, what does this all kind of add up to? So I think sometimes it can be hard to contextualize where Michigan is nationally. And the reality is Michigan is doing very well in these areas nationally. We're looked at consistently by our colleagues in other states as a state that's really adopted an evidence-based approach to not only corrections, but also parole decision-making and supervision in the communities. We have a lot of states that come to Michigan to see how we do it. And one of the key reasons for that is over the last 2 decades, we went from having a recidivism rate, meaning how many people return to prison within 3 years of release, of 45% to 22.7%. So we cut our recidivism rate in half as a state in just 2 decades' time. So that's a significant, testament to the impact that our employees are having and the work that they're doing in the facilities, in the community, et cetera. We are, as a state, very programmatically focused. To us, operating safe prisons is a given. We want to make sure that that happens, but we also want to make sure that as people are incarcerated, that time is used productively to actually change how they're going to function when they get out of prison. Because there's no value to taxpayers and to the state if they leave and they're pretty much in the same spot and they just come back. So we really, as a state, have really focused in on how do we do that. Vocational villages, access to other programming, et cetera, all kind of add up to that goal. So finally, before questions, I would just want to extend an open invitation to the committee members. Some of you have taken us up on this in the past, but for those that have not, feel free to learn more about our operations. There's several ways to do that. One is to come visit our prisons. There's a lot to learn from being hands-on and talking to our staff. I'm happy to make those arrangements for you. Another is to visit our field offices. That's a little less common, but there's actually a lot of work going on for parole and probation around the state, and sometimes it's best to see it kind of in action. And then the final thing is, and this is kind of unique, if you want to learn more about the parole process, which I suspect several of you may, we're happy to host you. You can come over to our office. You can sit over a parole board member's shoulder and watch them do the interview or do several interviews, see how those interviews occur, and can absolutely make those arrangements so you can learn more about kind of what that actually looks like and what those parole board members are doing as they work through those cases. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you for that. I think we have lots of questions around, parole, some of the guidelines, things like that. So I'm going to start on our side with Rep. Harris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kyle, thank you for being here. I know I've taken advantage of one of those tours. It was really impressive, especially the vocational side of things. I also have to compliment you guys. I have experience with some of your embedded agents. It's probably one of the best partnerships our police department has taken on. It's been very effective, and again, it's a great partnership, and so I appreciate you guys doing that. Getting to my questions. So you talked about the makeup of the parole board and whatnot. How are the public members selected?
So that's a great question. So if somebody had interest, they could actually go to the appointments webpage that exists, like for the governor's office, even though these final selections are made by the MDOC. If somebody just had general interest, they can actually apply through that appointments webpage. We also tend to get referrals. So we have folks who reach out to me or others within the department and say, hey, I have somebody who might be interested in that. We advance all of those resumes to the director and others who would be involved in that. So those are kind of the two ways to do it, is sort of just express interest either through that website or by contacting somebody at the MDOC. When it comes to actual selection, obviously they're looking at sort of what vacancies exist on the board and sort of what are our coverage areas. So we almost always have an assistant prosecutor or a former assistant prosecutor or prosecutor on the board. We see value in having that perspective on the parole board. We historically have had somebody with expertise sort of more in the social work realm or human services realm. We've also usually had somebody with some kind of educational background, like higher education. So we do, it's not that those spots are like designated only for those folks, but we do sort of look for some of those professional balances to get that perspective. If you're gonna have 10 people in the room together, having some of those voices is really important.
And just, Madam Chair, a follow-up if I can. So what types of training or continuing ed do any of the parole members get, especially the ones from public that may not have come from a background that deals directly with MDOC? And, are they things that help them interpret risk assessments and, apply these supervision standards and whatnot? I mean, what types of things are we looking at?
Yeah, so the training for the parole board members kind of happens at a couple different levels. So I think the highest level and probably most important training is the parole board actually does training with outside experts on evidence-based decision-making and structured decision-making. So we bring in folks from organizations like the National Institute of Corrections, et cetera, to actually help them understand risk, understand how to use those tools, understand how to balance that out. So that's a key element for any board member to participate in those. In addition, we do a lot of kind of training throughout the year where it's, for instance, if they're having an executive session, we might bring in the people who run our sexual abuse prevention program, and they may spend a couple hours with the parole board members really walking them through and understanding what are the unique risks of people who have a sexual offense? What is the programming meant to do? What are these different risk assessments, because there's some specialized risk assessments for that group. What do these risk assessments actually mean? So parole board members are being trained consistently. Like every month they're getting more information. There's obviously some upfront more intensive training when you're new, but then there's that consistent training throughout. And then the final thing we try to do is actually get them into facilities from time to time so that they're also engaging and understanding what's happening in the facilities, sort of what's happening on the ground, also into the field offices so they understand what's happening on the ground there so that they're not kind of operating in an isolated fashion away from where some of that other work is actually happening.
Great, thank you.
Rep. Schutte.
Thank you. Appreciate your presentation today. Could you tell us a little bit more about what measures are in place to evaluate the effectiveness of the parole board's decisions in terms of recidivism rates and public safety outcomes?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, recidivism is probably the key factor that most states look at. Michigan certainly looks at that as well. We are trying to broaden out our metrics a little bit because recidivism is really only looking at, if you think about it, sort of what's the rate of failure. And there's a whole nother side of the story, which is sort of what's the rate of success. So we are trying to broaden out to look at other things like employment rates and things like that. That being said, we monitor the parole board's activities both in terms of how many cases are they reviewing? Are they timely in those reviews? We do not, and I want to be really clear about this, we do not influence the parole board's decision making. It rests with the parole board. Statutorily, it rests with the parole board and the members there. But then we obviously monitor outcomes and want to make sure that we understand those outcomes. If we have cases that do not go as we would have hoped, we will absolutely, review those and see if there's something that we missed or something that should impact how we do things in the future. Again, from a recidivism perspective, Michigan is one of the states that has done the most over the last 2 decades to significantly reduce its recidivism rate. It's a little hard to compare state to state because not all states use the same measure, but we use the most common measure that states use, and we're definitely somewhere between top 5 and top 7 using that measure nationally. So we pay close attention to that. Ultimately, though, it's not just the parole decision that goes into public safety. It's what happens before the parole decision in terms of getting people ready for parole, and then it also is what happens after that decision in terms of the supervision techniques that are used. And so that's a key element as well, is making sure that we have those evidence-based supervision techniques, make sure that we're reacting promptly to kind of the first sign of a potential issue rather than waiting for it to become something more significant.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Johnson.
Let's see here. How often are registered victims' rights exercised in the parole process, and does their input statistically influence future parole decisions?
I will have to get back to you in terms of how often registered victims participate. I don't actually have access to that information because it's confidential, but let me see if I can find that out for you. Obviously, I know that victims do engage in the process when they choose to do so. It's an automated process for them to receive notice. So as long as you're registered, you receive notice, and then it's up to the victim to do it. In terms of how often it impacts the parole board's decision-making, the statute itself kind of points to the fact that what the parole board is to look at primarily when it comes to victim input is, were there impacts on the victim that were not accounted for in original sentencing? So, and that was part of the objective parole statute that was passed several years ago. So the parole board takes in information from the victim on anything the victim wants to share, including the impact that may have already been covered in sentencing. But a lot of what the parole board is going to seek is, well, what wasn't known then that might be known now? Obviously, if a victim expresses concerns about their safety, that is going to be heavily weighed. And we do have victims who will come in and say, hey, this is a person who has continued to try to make contact with me while they're incarcerated or has had other people try to make contact with me. That absolutely would be heavily weighed in the decision. It may be enough to not parole the person, or it may result in other safeguards, like they can't enter a certain county, et cetera. So they do take that impact or that input seriously. But again, I think it would be hard to say kind of statistically how often it impacts it, because it's one element of several that the parole board is required to look at in the process. But I will try to get some information about how many victim interviews were done last year. Yep.
Rep. Boyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How are you, Cal?
I'm doing well.
Good to see you again. Couple questions, if I may. First one is, you mentioned that the statute requires that you regularly review the cases, right? There's a layout for you to do that. And you may have said this, but I want for clarity. What determines their eligibility for parole, I guess, would be the first piece of it. And then if they're denied, I'll add the second one. You can fill them both in. If they're denied, when can they be re-eligible? And then I do have a little follow-up on that, but I'll let you answer that first.
So on those first two, so when somebody enters the MDOC, they will have a judgment of sentence from the sentencing judge that will give the minimum sentence, and it may have jail credits on it. So if they were held in jail pretrial, and so we'll discount the sentence by the jail credits, we will then calculate their minimum sentence. If it's a newer case, it's going to be truth in sentencing, so we know it's going to be 100% of that. So what will happen is, when we're roughly 5 to 6 months from whatever that date is on the minimum sentence, the parole board will just start reviewing the case. They'll start to pull information on the case, they'll start to schedule interviews, et cetera. Most of that work will happen, including the interviews, before the actual date that they're eligible, but they will not be released before that date. That's truly the earliest date they could potentially be released. So it is really based on that minimum sentence that we kind of initiate that process. If somebody has been denied parole, the parole board has a little bit of flexibility to determine how long until they have to review again. And again, this is in statute, and I think we actually worked with the chair's office to give us some more flexibility on certain cases. So most cases would have to come back up either 12 months or 24 months after denial, but there is a provision where in certain really kind of heinous cases where we know that the factors at play are not going to result in a positive parole decision, the majority of the parole board can jointly decide we don't want to look at this case for 5 years. And that's the maximum. We can't go beyond 5 years. They can then say we're not going to look at this case for 5 years. The reason for that is obviously having to go through the parole process again and again and again is potentially re-traumatizing for the victims. So the parole board in those cases wants to be able to essentially give victims more time between having to engage in the process. But for most cases, it's either going to be 12 months or 24 months.
Okay. And I would imagine that at, let's say, a subsequent hearing for parole, that the information, the findings, the determinations, the opinions, the positions from the previous finding are held in that information. They have that information to dwell back on.
Yep.
Is that an accurate assumption?
Yep.
Okay, if I may, can you indulge me on one more? So you may or may not have this information with you, but how many of our parolees, probationers, how many are absconders currently relative to the number that are out there?
There's about 700 parole absconders right now, and that's down from about 1,000 just a couple of years ago. So we've actually been able to significantly reduce parole absconders. The probation absconder number I will get you is much higher, and that's because there's, the probationers are subject to the circuit court, so we're not actually, MDOC isn't solely or primarily responsible for providing those, and there are a lot of people who are probation absconders for like very small crimes from 20 years ago, and they just haven't reported to close those cases out. So I can get you the number, but the probation number is quite high. But for the parole number, it's about 700 against 9,000 that are being supervised. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Rep Waz.
Thank you for being here. On paroles, how many defendants go directly to a parole situation rather than prison?
So they would go directly to probation potentially rather than parole. I can get you that number. I mean, that's a pretty significant number. Some will do a short jail sentence beforehand, but that's actually much more common than prison it would be to go to probation.
Is that number included in the 32,000 for parolees?
It would be in the 32,000 for probationers, yep.
Okay. And with the prison capacity at 32.5, in business there's a point where the amount of work you've got to do or the amount of prisoners, in this instance, prisoners, the overhead eats up whatever you're doing to try. What are we at that point?
So no, that's a great question. So we actively manage our bed capacity around the state. So we have 26 facilities. If we had every bed operating at all those facilities, we would essentially have too many beds online, and it would be very inefficient because you'd have to staff those beds, you'd have to utilities, everything else. So what we do is we close individual housing units when we don't need the beds, and we do that for two reasons. One, we don't need the beds, but just as importantly, then we don't need the staff to run those beds. And so that helps reduce the pressure on our staffing of those sites. So we have individual units offline at several facilities around the state. Over time, if we can get enough kind of units offline to add up to a prison, then we would talk about closing a prison. We are a couple years out now from our last prison closure, but as we saw the prison population decline significantly, just going back on the slide here, kind of this, the last drop off, we closed several prisons. So we closed one prison in the UP, one up in the Traverse City area, one in Ionia, one in Muskegon, half of one in Adrian. So we do try to keep our capacity tight against what our actual needs are for cost reasons. Right now, we're not in a position to suggest that we should close any prisons, but we are in a position of having several housing units closed.
One more question. You talked about an accumulation of assault offenses, and it was quite a peak. Now, has that been a trend where it's been going down and all of a sudden we had a peak? And if we had a peak, what's the reason?
I think that if you talk to anybody who works in this space, they would say that while the prisoner population has gone down, the severity of the behavior of the people in that setting, many of them, has gotten worse. And I think some of that is sort of like a distilling effect, like there's fewer people to kind of spread out some of those numbers and who it leaves you with are more likely to have assaultive offenses, and quite honestly, in a lot of cases, more likely to be difficult to manage in our setting. So I think that may be what is driving a lot of this. COVID was a very strange time for the criminal justice system. And I don't know, you may have heard from others who have testified before me, but in 2020 and 2021, it was like the brakes got slammed on a system that had never stopped before. And so I think that also created some weird kind of impacts. I mean, we released the same number of people within 10 in 2020 as we did in 2019. So there was no push by the Department of Corrections to release more people due to COVID. We had essentially the exact same parole rate, but our intake just stopped. So we just weren't getting people in 2020, and we didn't get all that many people in 2021. I think as the criminal justice system has sort of reinvigorated itself and started back up, it's probably focused more on assaultive offenders going through the system, more so than the non-assaultive stuff, and that's probably where some of that more recent accumulation of those cases is
So
coming
there is
from.
a combination of the prisoners being more active or more assaultive, but also the judiciary system being more cognizant of what's going on.
Yeah, not to speak for any other part of the system, but I think that's a pretty good assessment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have a couple of statements and questions. So one thing that I guess wasn't touched on in this was the most recent Supreme Court case. So I kind of had to chuckle when you said life with parole or without parole means life without parole, when it really doesn't, when you have a judicial system that's legislating from the bench. So here we are. We're looking at this situation with the Supreme Court in 19 and 20-year-olds. And I know I personally have reached out and gotten information from you, but can you share with us, number one, the number of offenders that are in prison right now that fall in that category, and then the number of people that fall in a subcategory of that were sentenced prior to 1998? Because as you know, we had a situation with release after one of the resentencing hearings last year. And I'm just curious if there's, I'm just going to ask you all these questions at once. In that process also of once we have the rehearings and you have to redo the calculations, including, good time that was in statute prior to 1998. Kind of what we're doing to help phase these people back into society that have essentially under the new calculations have served their sentence. And you can't necessarily parole them like they're just released from prison, like the situation that I know that you're aware of from November. Like, are there measures in place now to help these people get reacclimated to society as well, when basically they're not at a point of being eligible for probation or parole? They're just let out.
Yeah, so those are great questions. And I apologize. I do have that data, but I'm just trying to, I've got it in my email. So as long as I'm allowed to reference my phone, I'll be good. First, the big question: how many cases does the MDOC believe are impacted by this recent decision of 19 and 20-year-olds potentially being subject to resentencing? Our count is 582 right now. Now, we think at least maybe 2 or 3 of those cases have other life sentences that are not subject to resentencing, so they may get resentenced on one, but they'll still be serving a life sentence. I know of at least one case yesterday where I was talking to an attorney where it appears the person was booked originally by the court with the wrong birth date. So there might be a couple cases like that that either move in or out of the category, but let's say 580 roughly. We also believe there's about 300 cases of the younger groups that were decided by earlier decisions, so either 17 or under or 18. So you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 cases that are still subject to potential resentencing, which is significant. It's almost a quarter of the life without parole cases that the MDOC has right now. To the question of sort of where do these cases fall, so just as a really quick primer, oftentimes people will talk about good time as a credit system, and that was in place for many years in Michigan. So if you had a month where you didn't get any serious misconducts, you got time taken off your sentence. The amount of time that got taken off escalated depending on how many years you had served. And then that was followed by a period of time which we call Proposal B, where you got good time on the maximum, but you got disciplinary credits on the minimum. Disciplinary credits similar to good time, but a different calculation, but basic idea the same. Then there's a period with just disciplinary credits on the minimum and the maximum. And then we reached truth in sentencing in 1998. So that being said, of the cases that we kind of did an initial first blush run on, we thought about 41 are eligible for good time on the minimum and the maximum. That means when these cases, if they are resentenced to a term of years, it is highly likely they will be subject to immediate discharge from the MDOC. So like we would get the paperwork from the court Wednesday morning and they would be leaving prison Wednesday afternoon.
I'm sorry to interrupt
Yeah.
you, but in that process now, like, are you working with the locals in regards to the victim notification? Because, you know, when it's kind of an immediate release like that, I mean, it's kind of shocking to the families, the victims that are still alive today. So I'm just curious, like, how quickly can the victims be notified? Because they weren't notified till the guy walked out.
Yeah. So ideally, and again, not saying this happens in all cases, it clearly hasn't, but ideally, because they're going through an entire resentencing process with the court, they should be getting notice of that resentencing process. So the victim, from the local prosecutor, from the court, and so the victim should know that this person is subject to resentencing, they're having hearings, potentially they can participate in those hearings. If we reach a point where they get a new judgment of sentence on Wednesday morning and they're subject to immediate discharge Wednesday afternoon, we will provide notice Wednesday afternoon, but we have no way to provide notice to the victim before that, because until we get the actual judgment of sentence from the court, they're still technically serving a life sentence. We can also not hold them past their maximum for the sake of notification because we have lost legal jurisdiction to hold them, so we have to physically release them. So so I think that is a challenge. I think the more communication can occur with victims during the actual resentencing process, the better, because then they'll kind of know the trajectory that these cases are on. So there are about 41 cases we think that are subject to good time on the minimum and the maximum. So they would probably be those immediate discharge cases if they are resentenced. And again, the court decision does leave some space for a new life sentence. So that's a possibility in some of these cases, but if they get a term a year, they would be released. There's about 22 that fall into the Proposal B window, so they get disciplinary credits on the minimum, good time on the maximum. They also could be subject to immediate discharge, so we're up to about 60, 65 cases. And then the next big group is the disciplinary credits. They, because of when they were sentenced, probably are not subject to immediate discharge, but would almost certainly be subject to parole eligibility after resentencing. Now, in those cases, just because you're parole eligible does not mean the parole board has to give you a hearing on Wednesday afternoon. We would get the new judgment of sentence. We would update their times. We would start the notice process. It would generally take several months before they'd actually be considered for parole. So there's not we don't expedite. I mean, we try to be, efficient in how we handle those cases, but we don't skip any of the notice requirements. We don't shortcut anything on that. We still go through every required step for parole consideration. And then the last group, which is, around 260 are the truth in sentencing cases. Those possibly on realistically, the 98, 99 cases might be coming up on their minimum depending on what the resentencing is, but most will probably not even be parole eligible yet. So to the question of like, what are we doing with these cases? Yeah, this is a big push internally with the MDOC because these are folks that historically we assumed were never going to leave prison. So they are doing things while they're in prison, but we, to be honest, have not given them access to all of the programs or all of the opportunities that we have generally reserved for folks we know are going home. Because we need to apply our resources judiciously and so our mindset has historically been we need to focus on the people who are going home first. We did make a change actually in November of last year to open up our core programming, so that's things like violence prevention programming, cognitive behavioral therapy, to people serving life sentences, regardless of their life sentence, any life sentences, back in December. We're in a good enough spot with our program wait list that we decided to do that before this decision even came out. With this decision, we will be moving these cases towards the front of those wait lists over some other lifers because we just know that their situation may change. We're also doing a lot of the sort of reentry planning stuff on an accelerated basis. So things like vital documents, historically we would have helped these folks get birth certificates, but we would not have helped them get social security cards or driver's licenses / state IDs because they couldn't have used those last two documents. Now they're in the queue to get all that stuff. So we're working on that stuff. We are working on some workshops and some other sort of training opportunities for folks outside of like formal programs. The reality is these folks, enter prison somewhere between the age of probably 19 and 21, 22, depending on how long it took for their case to go through the court process. They've done the bulk of their adult life in the prison setting. They're well acclimated to that setting, but may not be well acclimated to the community setting. So we're working with them. We'll have some workshops around technology and other things like that that'll be specific to them. Probably the one thing I would say, or the one big ask from the Department of Corrections, is going back to those cases that immediately discharge. So if these cases are parole eligible and they parole, they can get services in the community through the MDOC and our contractors to support their parole. Temporary housing, transportation assistance, job placement assistance, other kind of basic social supports. If you discharge from the MDOC, we cannot spend money on you. You're not under our jurisdiction. There's one exception to this. If you're exonerated, we can do it. The legislature gave us that ability, but otherwise we can't. Representative Amos O'Neill, your colleague, has a bill to remedy this for these cases. We would really love to see the legislature do that, so that if we have one of these immediate discharge cases, we can at least do some transitional housing, employment support, social supports, because from a public safety perspective, we will all be better off if folks have that transition after such a long period of incarceration. It's not really going to help us to just say, hey, you're out, but if you don't have support, best of luck. We will all be better off if we can help kind of guide them through that initial transition. So we would certainly advocate for Rep. O'Neill's bill, in light of the decision.
Rep. Breen.
Thank you, Chair Leitner. Thank you, Mr. Kaminsky. If I'm understanding this correctly, just the top lines, you've got fewer people going into the system. They are getting longer sentences, but you're having better outcomes after they're discharged. Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. The budget that was passed by the House is about a 25% reduction in funding for your department, and I'm curious as to also how much you receive in federal funds. I think it's around $5 million, and I don't know if there are any federal funds that are currently on the chopping block, but I'm wondering what of those funds, if any, pertain to victim services, and what impact would this have on your department if that 25% reduction goes through, or if there's any impact to the federal funds that you currently receive.
Sure.
Just a second, Kyle. Just to be clear, the budget that was passed by the House was a government shutdown prevention plan. That was not a full intended budget. So just to be clear on that. But you can answer the federal part and the dollars and how that affects the department
absolutely.
as is.
And we have a really positive working relationship with our subcommittee chairman, Rep. Slaw, so we're looking forward to developing a final budget, amongst all parties. So we're looking forward to that. Federal funding, as you mentioned, not a real significant part of the MDOC's budget. We're mostly GFGP funded. Some of the areas that we get federal funding for are some of our specialized education programs like Title I. We get some Perkins grants, which helps with career and technical education. We do receive some funding from the federal government as well for some PREA support, so that's the Prison Rape Elimination Act. To date, we're not seeing a significant direct impact on the MDOC is probably the best way I should describe it in terms of the funds that we receive directly. We are seeing where external partners are starting to see some impact from changes in federal funding, but not really changing how we're approaching our work, we'll just kind of continue to stay focused on what we have direct control over. So that's where we're at. Certainly paying attention to the federal situation, but not really having an immediate impact on the MDOC.
Could we talk offline later about some of those partners that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Rep. Hope.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kaminsky, for being here today. I'm going to ask a totally different question than the questions that have been asked so far. I grew up in Ionia. I lived less than a mile from a prison for my whole childhood and adolescence. And my family was a corrections family. My grandfather was a corrections officer. Both my parents were. So I know it's a stressful job, kind of firsthand. But I also know that all three of the people I just mentioned from my family toughed it out until retirement. They all worked until retirement age. Pay was different back then. Benefits were more generous. And of course, they had a pension. Have you given any thought to how a pension may affect turnover, retention, even recruitment, and
So I appreciate the question. I think from the department's perspective, obviously, we're always wondering how things may impact us in those areas, both good or bad. For us, we're primarily focused on the piece of the pie that we actually can exert some control over, which is pay. And even there, we don't exert direct control, but through the Office of the State Employer, through collective bargaining. And so that's why we've really focused in on what is sort of the, what's the pay situation? How quickly can people advance? What's the actual dollar amount that you can put on a billboard or a flyer to draw people in? And how do you, really try to put something out there that when folks reach that top step, and again, for us, top step later this year will be 54 months, is a real living, not just living wage, but like a quality wage. And we think we're certainly closer to that than we've ever been at $73,000 a year. So we have not really weighed in on the retirement question. That's a question for others and other branches of government. But we're obviously monitoring that, but going to continue to focus in on pay, because that's the thing that we think we have the most control over.
If I may ask a quick follow-up. Sure. I'm just wondering about if you've calculated the cost of overtime and then the cost of turnover. I know there's the cost associated with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, both are significant. We are obviously dealing with a need for overtime at many of our facilities right now, both voluntary and mandatory. And so, we would like to see more of our positions filled. That's very much our stance, is that we're trying to get our positions filled. Turnover, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, we pay people while they're in the academy. So if people aren't retained by us, there's an investment there that we maybe don't fully recoup. But ultimately, we need to kind of keep pushing forward and trying to find new folks. For us, it's about trying to create an environment that people are more likely to want to stay in. I think that's the other thing, is there's a lot of talk oftentimes about the pay and benefits for these jobs, which is very understandable. But it's also, what's the environment? What's the culture? Are we creating a culture and environment that people want to be in, or are we creating a culture and environment that is more likely for people to leave? I think as a department, the last several years, we've tried to really be more aware of that, more sensitive to that. We've made investments in our facilities, particularly kind of touch points for staff, new technology for staff, better surroundings for staff, because that's part of it too. But there's no doubt we watch our costs pretty closely, and we'd like to see more of our positions filled just on a permanent basis with folks who stay long term.
Minority Vice Chair Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Kyle, having sat through this for 4 terms now. And I'm impressed that you look and you see the slides and you go. But real quick, when you talk about the folks that are being released, I think that at this time we're talking about a public safety trust, and they have some community violence intervention folk that maybe you can rope into, that when these folks are being released, even on short notice or long notice, that they may have some resources available. So if that's something that we can kind of work on, because again, if we throw people out that can't swim, they're either going to drown or they're going to come back to shore, right. And we don't want either.
No, I fully agree with that analogy, and would love to know kind of who to connect with on that.
Thank you, Kyle. We still have some more questions, but obviously we're out of time. So I will email you some questions because I still have a few more follow-up in regards to parole and maybe your trends. I just kind of have a comment there. You talk about the felony dispositions and, and then you talked about the average minimum sentence. And I'm just curious if maybe what the actual crime is, because as we're seeing, you mentioned specialty courts, right? So we have specialty courts, diversion programs, whatever. And so maybe the people that would normally serve those lower sentences aren't actually going to prison. So the people who are, I guess, the worst ones are, and so their sentences are by default already longer, right? So I'm just curious if we, if maybe somewhere you guys have a breakdown of what they are actually there for and what the disposition is, because I can tell you of a case right now that just happened in Oakland County where they got a CSC second degree, pled guilty to that, and were only sentenced to 300 days in jail, in Oakland County Jail. And that's disgusting because I know some details of the case. So they didn't even go to prison. So I'm wondering if, we're just not sending people to prison. So that it's just more of a comment. But I will submit a list of questions to you that you can get back with the committee on. But I appreciate your time. Sorry you've been under fire all day this morning, since 9 o'clock. So I appreciate you taking one for the team. With that, I see no further business. We already excused absent members. So I am going to adjourn at the call's chair.